Dead Rising 4 has proven to be, by a very wide margin, one of the hardest games for me to write about. Getting my thoughts onto paper has been surprisingly challenging, and this video actually represents my third attempt at reviewing it. The game has one of the more interesting release histories of the franchise. After Dead Rising 3 went back to its Microsoft exclusive roots, and still hasn't appeared on PlayStation, DR4 seemed to do the same thing with simultaneous Xbox One and Windows 10 releases on December 6th, 2016. As you know, I don't have an Xbox One and currently have no intentions of buying one, so I skipped the initial release. It then came to Steam on March 14th, 2017, and that's a version I originally picked up and started playing. I dropped the game pretty quickly out of sheer boredom and apathy, with only 4 hours playtime on the clock. In July 2017, I made my first attempt to review the game. I started a new save file, began recording footage, and wrote a good portion of a review script where I described my frustrations with the title. Then in September 2017, we got two announcements. Dead Rising 4 was coming to PS4, and with its release, the existing Xbox One and PC versions would also get a free update that, on paper, claimed to address a lot of the complaints that were in my original review script. Seeing as so many issues were due to be fixed, I tossed that review in the bin and waited for Frank's big package. On the 5th of December 2017, I bought the then newly released PS4 version of Dead Rising 4 with a renewed intent to review the game, but only made it around 2 hours in before disappointment set in, and I just started playing more interesting and engaging games instead. Heck, even over the past month, I've had to force myself through this game, and even considered cancelling the review outright. During the 8-hour campaign of Dead Rising 4, I've also been playing Dragon Ball Xenoverse 1 and 2, Mega Man Legends, and the Spider-Man DLC, because Dead Rising 4 has utterly failed to hold my attention. It's easy to play and write about a really good game. You can absolutely gush over it and explain why it was a fantastic experience that made you feel great. Likewise, it's easy to write about a terrible game. You can slam all of its bad decisions and describe how it disgusted you. Dead Rising 4 is neither of those. It's bland, generic, vanilla, uninspired, middle-of-the-road, designed by committee, safe, mediocre, uninteresting, boring, tedious, predictable, cliché, tropey, unremarkable, focus tester, dull, flat, and tame. It left me feeling nothing. I was hollow, bored, apathetic, and left with absolutely no incentive to continue playing beyond a sense of obligation to provide a review for you guys. This is the first time that the simple act of playing a game has felt like work or a chore. But I do think there's value in discussing why the game made me feel that way, so let's cut the preamble and dive headfirst into Dead Rising 4. I tried to separate the politics of a game's promotion and development from the resulting product, but in this case I don't think that's possible because Dead Rising 4's core issue is that its central promises simply aren't delivered. Capcom tried to appeal to core fans with a campaign that promised Frank West was back and returning to Willamette. This was exciting at the time. Frank's by far the most popular protagonist of the series, as evidenced by Dead Rising 2 off the record's existence. And hardcore fans like Stippo have poured hours into trying to find out what existed of Willamette beyond the first game's mall. People who had been on board with the series since the first game were hoping for a return to form, something made specifically for them. Sadly, this is Frank West and Willamette in name only. Frank has clearly had some work done, considering he's gone from this, to looking surprisingly like my dad, actually. I don't buy the transformation or that this is the same guy, and it goes beyond mere looks. He's also sporting a new voice actor, with Ty Olsson replacing TJ Rotolo. Now, it's not the first or last time a voice actor's been replaced, and Olsson's a fine voice actor on his own merits. But when the game opens by repeating some of our favourite lines from the first entry, it just seems like Capcom are being disrespectful to their own legacy. Finally, we have Frank's behaviour and characteristics. It almost feels like Frank has split personality disorder. One second he's an angry, burned out, resentful man who feels like he was buried by the government for trying to expose their involvement in past outbreaks. The next second he's cracking wise, quoting memes, and taking selfies? I think the writers wanted to mature his character and present someone who's become understandably bitter and detached, but the marketing team wanted someone a teenage to young adult player base could relate to, and uses their avatar in that world. But you just can't have both. The result feels like someone's dad trying to be cool by dabbing 6 months too late. So Frank West doesn't look, sound, or act the same. How does Willamette fare? All we saw of the town before was a single street and the mall itself, yet neither return. The mall featured this time is a brand new memorial megaplex that was only open for a single day before the outbreak started. The surrounding town meanwhile doesn't seem to match up with the brief glimpses we got in Dead Rising 1 or Stippo's work viewing and connecting the original in-game models. So is, for all intents and purposes, brand new. For me, while Willamette does have landmarks, I didn't get to know the town very well. I've said this before, but smaller, intimate, more richly detailed maps appeal to me because there are more unique assets and I know where I am at all times. I can quickly figure out which areas are useful for which tasks or resources, and you then start developing favourite spots. While Dead Rising 4 does apply some nice theming to the different areas of the mall, there's an Aztec area, a pirate ship, and a Christmas village to name a few, there's really nothing of significance in those locations. Half the shops are closed and the rest are either too bland to stand out or too packed with zombies to really spend much time in. There are maintenance tunnels and a hotel to explore, but I was lacking incentive. It took too long to get from point A to B and was overall a half-hearted slog. The town itself, meanwhile, ended up being a series of generic buildings. There's a clear difference between downtown and the more rural farmland, sure, and the story has you visit a variety of locations like a dam, a winery, and the sewers, but I never knew where I was or where I needed to go without first consulting the map. Personally, I don't even believe the town would still be standing or have been repopulated in the first place. At the end of the first game, the military's orders are to kill any survivors, while in later games, firebombing infected cities becomes the standard response to outbreaks. Whenever Willamette comes up, it carries a sense of weight, almost as if it should only be spoken of in hushed tones. It was home to the first zombie outbreak. Over 53,000 people died. A town just doesn't recover from that kind of thing, and will forever carry a certain reputation. I think there's a massive missed opportunity here, as I'd have loved to have seen a ruined and abandoned Willamette, revisit a disrepaired version of the original mall, and actually feel some familiarity with the environment, similar to how Metal Gear Solid 4 treated Shadow Moses Island. It would have been far more interesting than what we got. Dead Rising 4 continues to abandon its roots and unique selling points in the gameplay department too. While the timer had gotten more lenient with each new game, Dead Rising 4 takes the bold move of eliminating it completely. For me, most of the fun in Dead Rising came about from replaying it, planning routes and trying to save everyone while killing all the psychopaths and completing all story missions, with that strict time limit in place. It meant putting thought and care into every decision, knowing which weapons and items you'll need, and juggling multiple tasks at the same time. It was a unique core mechanic that added a layer of tension and urgency. A Dead Rising game with no timer just isn't a Dead Rising game. Survivors are largely the same as they were in Dead Rising 3. You clear out enough zombies in the area immediately around them, and they'll magically see themselves to the nearest emergency shelter, no escort required. It's kind of boring, and you don't remember any of their names or faces. I can recall the survivors in Dead Rising 1 and 2, I know their personalities, their backstories, and I actually want to save them. Here they're just NPC number 7. 2017's free update did add new survivors who actually do require an escort or give you a unique mission. Placed as distress calls, these survivors are actually a lot more memorable and fun to rescue. I even encountered one who wanted 3 photos taken on a tight time limit. For a brief moment, I was scrambling around more clumsily and desperately, just going with whatever tools were immediately available to try and beat the clock, and you know what? For 5 minutes it actually felt like Dead Rising again, and I was having fun. It's a shame that was pretty much the only use of the mechanics Dead Rising built its name on. What about psychopaths? Well, they're now known as maniacs, and they now lack the classic cutscenes that would play on their introduction and defeat. The most you get is a radio message saying, "Hey, there's a creep over here." You go over there, have a fight, and they die with 0 fanfare. Capcom promised to address this complaint in 2017's free update, but all they really did was give each maniac a unique weapon they drop when beaten. Whoopee! There are some decent setups. For example, you're told a cult is performing zombification experiments on people, but when you get there, you just walk through, killing the cult and their leader on an entirely self-led path that doesn't seem to respond to you in any meaningful way. Hell, even the hostages I saved just continued to sit there after killing the boss. There's a new gameplay element in the form of investigations. Essentially, Dead Rising 4 saw Arkham Origins crime scenes and said, yeah, I reckon I can do that. They're ultimately tedious and just boil down to walking around an area, pointing your camera at the next thing you need to photograph. There's little to no thought involved, as it just reminds me of a hidden object game. The difficulty is now at an all-time low. Dead Rising 1 was brutal and punishing, demanding multiple runs. Dead Rising 2 had better balancing. Dead Rising 3 was a cakewalk, but Dead Rising 4 may as well be on autopilot. The leveling system from 3 returns. You get 1 skill point per level, and you can then spend those points on more health, extra ammo, higher chances for critical hits, and build Frank to suit your playstyle. Problem is, the game throws level ups at you like they're confetti, to the point I regularly had 10 to 15 skill points built up at a time, and no real need to spend them given the general lack of challenge. Zombies are trivialized and no longer a threat. In Frank's nightmare, at the very start of the game, you're given a bunch of zombies and a rotating supply of weapons to just go to town on them with. Then, in the prologue chapter at level 1 with no upgrades, you have to kill around 150 zombies as part of the mandatory story beats, which includes 2 separate battles against caged hordes. Later on, you can use cars and exosuits to get your combo counter into the thousands, with little to no effort as you slaughter wave after wave of meaningless zombies. Soldiers get a very similar treatment. In previous games, the army would turn up towards the end as part of a cleanup operation, and they'd be comparatively much more of a threat than the undead you'd been fighting up to that point. Dead Rising 4 introduces them as early as Case 1. Worse still, they're practically guaranteed to drop a health pack when defeated, to the point each firefight ended with more first aid kits strewn around than I could carry. They're fodder, and this has stopped being a game about survival, horror, and resource management, and is instead an out-and-out power fantasy at this point. This is exemplified by the Exo power suits. These may as well be Hulkbusters, giving you superhuman strength and the ability to wield massive weapons. When you're in one of these, you're pretty much unstoppable unless your opponent happens to be wearing one too. You see, power creep is a major issue in Dead Rising 4. The normal zombies and soldiers aren't scary or threatening anymore, so instead you get exoskeletons and faster, more deadly undead foes in the form of freshly turned zombies and so-called evolved zombies, alongside a plot that centers around a supposedly massive monster that's been running rampant and tearing Willamette apart. These enemies are all just trying to fix the unbalanced difficulty that the developer's own power fantasy design focus created in the first place. Speaking of fixing problems, this game is riddled with bugs and glitches. During my playthrough, I experienced NPCs walking into walls, a classic. Zombies stuck inside objects, such as this unlucky fellow inside a staircase. Enemies teleporting during combat. Enemies firing at thin air despite me being right next to them. Bodies just floating in midair. loading a save file and Frank just being on fire for no reason. Bear in mind, that's not an extensive list, and I've not shown every instance I encountered here. Now, the original version of this game came out in December 2016. The PS4 version is the 4th release of it, and has been out since December 2017, with this footage being from my playthrough a year later in December 2018. To still have this quantity, severity, and frequency of glitches is simply unforgivable. In fact, the game's relatively unpolished overall. This video by Crobecat shows you how little details from Dead Rising 1, like dead zombies reacting to being shot, or being able to pull weapons off store shelves, are completely absent from Dead Rising 4. I'd suggest you check out their video for full details, but the fact there are enough examples for it to be 22 minutes long shows you how far the level of quality has dropped 3 games later, implying a rushed or pressured development cycle. I've not even gotten onto the plot yet. Suffice to say, it addresses the fact that a vaccine for the zombie virus was created at the end of Dead Rising 3, supposedly making future outbreaks like this one impossible. However, the explanation given is pretty predictable and boring. There are also some retcons for returning characters that I won't spoil here, but which didn't sit well with me. It honestly feels like Dead Rising 3 was intended to end the franchise's overall plot, but then corporate mandated yet another sequel, requiring a bit of an arse pull from the writing staff. Previous games have featured overtime mode. Traditionally, the best, but not always canonical ending is a cliffhanger, and the player then unlocks a new campaign that wraps things up. This time around, the equivalent mode was initially gated off as paid DLC. Spoilers follow, so click on this timestamp if you want to be safe. At the end of Dead Rising 4, Frank's infected, and it's a race against time to find a cure before he turns for good, echoing the overtime mode plot of Dead Rising 1. What really frustrates me is that Capcom advertised this paid DLC, including spoilers for the base game, within a week of Dead Rising 4 hitting Steam and being available to a brand new audience. It's borderline hilarious that Capcom could be this tone deaf. Zombie Frank is even on the box art for the PS4 game and on the splash screen when you launch it. Even worse, Frank Rising is considered to be the canonical ending. A true middle finger to people who bought the Xbox One version on launch, as they'd have to wait 4 months and pay more money to see the true ending of a game they'd just spent $49.99 on. Dead Rising 4 is the very definition of a shallow, insincere cash grab, and I can't recommend it to anyone. The game sold incredibly badly, with only 730,000 physical worldwide sales on Xbox One, and 140,000 physical worldwide sales on PlayStation 4, according to VGCharts.com. Capcom Vancouver have since closed their doors, with Dead Rising 5 having been cancelled. To be honest, it's probably for the best. I'll always love the first 2 games, but when it comes to Dead Rising 4, I'm not even mad, I'm just disappointed.